In this presentation, we're going to talk about Max Weber again. This is the second of two presentations on Max Weber. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about his ideas on bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a form of organization which is dominant in modern capitalistic societies. He would argue, Weber would, that bureaucracies are the clearest manifestation of this major concept of his, rationalization, which we talked about last time. The idea here is that bureaucracies create inequality because the elites are not bound by the rules and procedures of bureaucracies, but the masses are. So that's how it's associated with inequality. Now, Weber argued that it is impossible to escape bureaucracies once they're created in mass. So, for example, he would argue that Marx's idea of communism would not be able to escape the trappings of bureaucracies. And so we're going to go through different elements that Weber focuses on about bureaucracies, different characteristics. First, there's a clear division of labor within bureaucracies, that each person has a particular role to play. They have a job description that fixes their duties, right? And their level of authority is dictated by their position in the division of authority, right? So the idea here is you create a system where everyone plays a particular role, everyone's given a certain level of authority, and he also pointed out that this type of bureaucratic authority has not been around forever. In fact, it's a fairly recent invention, modern invention, which is associated with this process of rationalization. There's also, as we talked about last time, a tremendous amount of hierarchy in bureaucracies, right? The organization of bureaucracy is hierarchical, with a small number of people in charge and a lot of people at lower levels who are relatively powerless. There's also a lot of rules and regulations. There are a tremendous amount of record keeping in bureaucracies. There are people whose sole purpose is to be the administrative staff of a bureaucracy. You imagine working your whole career, and what is your purpose in life? Well, it's just to keep the engine of the bureaucracy running. There are very many people in our society whose roles are simply administrative staff. They just keep the bureaucracy functioning. Bureaucracies also tend to be impersonal, right? People are treated as cases, not as individual people with personalities and whatnot. They tend to be very efficient, but only in those cases that are foreseen in a unique situation. It's very difficult for a bureaucracy to deal with if they don't have rules and procedures in place, and we'll talk about that in a second. And finally, another characteristic of bureaucracies is the assumption of meritocracy, the idea that people rise in a bureaucratic hierarchy based on merit, that if you are good at your job, you can move up the bureaucracy, move up the hierarchy, and become more powerful, have more authority. Now, Weber did focus on a lot of the dysfunctions of bureaucracies, and we just said a moment ago, bureaucracies are clearly inefficient in unusual cases. Bureaucracies are very good at dealing with cases that, or a situation in which these situations are predictable, but when an unusual circumstance that the bureaucracy did not foresee, well then in that case, bureaucracies are not good at all in dealing with those situations. And you can see this, you may have experienced this level of frustration when you are dealing with the bureaucracy, you have an unusual circumstance, and they simply do not know how to handle your situation. It can be very frustrating. There's also psychological or personality characteristic that is associated with people who work in bureaucracies, and that's what Weber called trained incapacity, or another label for this is learned helplessness. In this case, you're talking about someone who is disempowered in their work life, right? Within the bureaucracy, they're not given the capability of making decisions. This is very much related to what Marx would talk about with alienation. People are going to be alienated when they can't think for themselves in their jobs. But a lot of bureaucracies make workers not able um, to make decisions. So I put a picture of a record store up here as an example, because way back when I worked in a record store for a few years, and I was a low-level clerk, sort of entry-level worker, and above me were assistant managers and managers. And I had worked there for longer than just about everybody in the store except for the manager, and so I had learned all the rules and procedures, and I knew how to do how to react, but because I was or how to react to unusual circumstances, but because I was a clerk, I didn't have any bureaucratic authority to do those types of things. So people would be, for example, say somebody wanted to make a return of a product that they had bought, um, I would just tell them what the return policy was, that they weren't, I wasn't able to make this return, and I would sit there and just hope that they would say, well, can I speak to a manager? Because I knew that if they spoke to a manager, the manager would allow the return, but I was not given the authority to do that myself, right? I would get in trouble if I stepped outside the parameters of my authority and started doing returns um, like that on my own. So essentially, in this situation, I was trained to be incapable of making decisions. Now, there's two possible results of this kind of immersion in a bureaucracy: a weak version of trained incapacity and a more stronger version of trained incapacity. So, for example, um, a weak version would be someone who works in a bureaucracy, knows how to think outside the box, outside the authority or what they're allowed to do, but simply doesn't do that because the bureaucracy doesn't allow for it. A strong version of trained incapacity is the point where someone's worked in a bureaucracy for so long that they're unable to think outside the box that's been created for them by the bureaucracy, right? They're unable to think for themselves because they've been immersed in a bureaucracy for so long. This is related to uh, the development of a bureaucratic personality. This idea here is that if you work in a bureaucracy long enough, this will stifle your creativity. You won't be able to make decisions. Potentially could bleed over into other aspects of your life other than your work life. And so you can see how this could lead to alienation from a Marxist point of view. People are stuck in bureaucracies, disempowered, not able to make decisions for themselves, and over time uh, adopt this bureaucratic personality in which they are less able to make decisions in general. All right, another dysfunction of bureaucracies is what Weber called goal displacement. This is the idea that bureaucracies often are created to achieve a particular goal. Now, the question that he asked was, what happens when this goal is completed? So here I have some pictures of um, bridges that are under construction. Right now, what happens when the bridge is completed? And you might create a whole bureaucracy to create a bridge, but bureaucracies, the point he's making is bureaucracies are very difficult to kill, to get rid of, right? Because people have a vested interest, they have jobs, and the livelihoods are linked to being involved in this bureaucracy. So instead of just disbanding a bureaucracy that was created to achieve a particular goal, once the goal is reached, instead of disbanding the bureaucracy, what typically takes place is a new goal is created. So this is what he calls goal displacement, right? That you'll create new goals for a bureaucracy just so the bureaucracy has something to do. And this is potentially inefficient and unnecessary work. Okay, fifth is this idea of bureaucratic enlargement. This takes place, it's related to goal displacement, but rather than on a macro level, we're talking about a micro level here within a person's day-to-day work life. That the idea here is that work will expand to fill the time allotted or the amount of money allotted, right? So um, if you give somebody 4 weeks to do a project and they could actually do the project in 2 weeks, if they're within a bureaucracy, there's an incentive for them to take their time and take the full 4 weeks to do the work, because if they do it in 2 weeks, then it's not as if they're going to get 2 weeks off of work. They're going to be given new tasks to do, right? So the idea here is you're slowing down. People may slow down their work, their pace of their work, as a way to not be given more work. Same thing with budgets. The idea here is in bureaucracies, certain divisions of an organization may be given a particular budget, and if they don't spend their whole budget in the fiscal year, well, what will happen the following year? They may be given a lower budget. So, so if a division of an organization is given a budget of $1 million, and near the end of the year they've only spent $900,000, then they may spend that extra money to justify $1 million budget the subsequent year. This is related to what Weber calls Parkinson's law, that work will expand to fill the time available for its completion. And so with this work slowdown, he argues that virtually all activity is unnecessary. Rather than letting people work efficiently, get their jobs done, and go home, a bureaucracy requires them to be there. If it's a 9-to-5 job, they can't leave before 5 o'clock, even if they've been productive and gotten everything done that they need to. They will be expected to stay there, so workers work more slowly and do things that are not actually required in their jobs. Another aspect of or dysfunction of bureaucracies is the authoritarian structure of bureaucracies. The idea here is there are these hierarchies within all bureaucracies, and communication typically is downward communication. And that means that those who are in the superior positions dictate to those below them in the hierarchy what they ought to be doing, and there's not very much feedback, right? So if there's no upward communication, that those leaders at the top of the hierarchy will be relatively unaware of the issues associated with the work of those at the bottom level. So an example of this is in the military would be if privates or corporals are unable to talk to their superior officers about concerns that they have, then the generals and the colonels may be unaware of the issues. And so essentially this rigid structure that does not allow for communication across different levels of the hierarchy disempowers workers. It doesn't allow the lower level workers to think or to provide feedback, and again can be quite alienating if you're put in that situation. And lastly, he talks about what he calls the Peter Principle. This is the idea that workers will rise to the level of incompetence within a bureaucracy. Now, I don't completely agree with this, but here's the idea he's talking about. He says, if bureaucracies are truly meritocratic, then people will, when they're good at their jobs, they will be promoted. And they will continue to be promoted, he argues, until they have reached a point where they're no longer good enough at their job to get another promotion. So they rise to the level of their incompetence. Taken to its logical conclusion would be that most employees would end up in positions that they're incompetent in. However, this assumes that people are going to be promoted when they are good at their jobs. Sadly, I think that that's not the case, that many people are in bureaucracies at a certain level that they could do their boss's job or their boss's boss's job, but they're in competition with a large number of people at their same level. And even if they're really good at their job, they may not get that promotion. They may not get the opportunity to fulfill their true, complete potential, to realize the talent that they have, because they are essentially stuck in a position that is not commensurate with their qualifications or their competency. So sadly, a lot of people sort of stagnate in a position that is lower than they would be able to flourish in if they were actually able to be given more authority and more leeway in making a greater contribution to the organization. When this is the case, there could be a large number of people who are not afforded the opportunity to flourish as much as they might, and we all lose out if that's the case, because We might have a larger number of people who are being really productive members of society, but their bureaucratic position holds them down and doesn't allow them to totally flourish to their full potential. Okay, so anyway, that's our discussion of bureaucracies and Max Weber. If you have any questions or comments, please post it on our course website, and thank you very much for listening.